Woof woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and thank you for tuning in to another video. So it's time for another review. I finally read another book. It only took me about 3 weeks, which must be some kind of record for me. But this time we're going to be looking at The Hulk by Jeph Loeb Omnibus. So yeah, it's entirely written by Jeph Loeb, who you might know from Superman Batman, Batman The Long Halloween, Batman Hush, and just a ton of other projects. It's highly unlikely that you don't know who Jeph Loeb is. And primarily the art's done by Ed McGuinness, but there's also a few guest artists throughout the series. This was about 27 issues in total, and continuity-wise it comes just shortly after World War Hulk. Since then it's been collected in various different formats. It came out in 6 trade paperbacks, 2 complete collections, but the easiest way to get it at the moment is this omnibus right here. But today we're going to take an in-depth look at this book. We're going to look at the plot, we're going to look at the art, we're going to do a spoiler-free review, and then we're going to get into a spoiler section. There's going to be timestamps below if you just want to skip to certain points, but I'm going to look and see if this is the best modern run of Hulk to come out in the last 20 years. So at the beginning of every review I do a too long didn't watch, which is a part where I tell you what the book's about if you don't really want to watch the full review. If you've read The Punisher Kills the Marvel Universe or you've read Deadpool Kills the Marvel Universe, it's pretty much just that, but it's got the Hulk in it. Actually, if you've got the World War Hulk Omnibus and a red pen, you can just colour in the Hulk and then you've pretty much got the same book. Because a more accurate title of this book is not Hulk by Jeph Loeb, it's World War Red Hulk. So if that's all the review that you needed, thank you for tuning in. Please remember to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe if you haven't done so already. But if you want a more in-depth review, that's going to start right here, and we're going to jump into the plot. So it's set shortly after World War Hulk, and like every other earth-shattering event that happens in the Marvel Universe every single year, the Earth has pretty much got back to normal after Bruce Banner's destructive tirade. A rampage of which mostly took place in New York City, despite the fact that it was somehow counted as a world war. We see the post-Civil War Iron Man take up a more updated role within the S.H.I.E.L.D. organisation as he's trying to handle all these various threats that are always attacking Earth. But that's until a new threat emerges. It's big, it's angry, it's strong, but it's somehow different from the regular Hulk just because of the fact that it's red. The first arc of this book focuses on this new threat of the Red Hulk as it pretty much decimates everyone in the Marvel Universe. He pretty much has the mantra of Dillian Y, like anybody who wants it can get it. So this means that the likes of Iron Man, Thor, She-Hulk, Abomination, A-Force, and even the Watcher end up being in the path of his wrath. I wasn't trying to rhyme then, that was just a happy coincidence. However, since the destruction that he inflicted on the planet, Bruce Banner is now held in a maximum security facility where he's being watched 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So there's no way that he could have been the Red Hulk, which leads to the mystery that carries the majority of this book of who is this Red Hulk. This question propels the majority of this story, and without spoiling too much, we see the Red Hulk trying to devise this grand plan so that he can get revenge on the organisations that have stood in his way in the past. Bruce Banner does have a role within this book, and the Green Hulk often shows up as well, but we're more exploring this new character, we're following him, and we're seeing how he ended up becoming in that final form. He's had connections to the Hulk in the past, so you're often getting these puzzle pieces as to who he is. However, with the world against him, the Red Hulk must align himself with former enemies, as his own plans that he's trying to craft, design and execute can often be turned against him, and the entire Marvel comic universe has him as public enemy number 1. So let's take a look at the art, the majority of which is done by Ed McGuinness, who is one of my top 10 all-time favourite artists. So I did have high expectations from the beginning, particularly given his work in Superman Batman, and this work exceeded all of them. A style like this is perfect for a book involving the Hulk because he draws muscles in such an overly comical way that it actually makes the Hulk look natural and everybody else seem like they're some kind of steroid-laced freak. This story actually made me wish that Marvel did Absolute Editions because I would just love to see Ed McGuinness' original pages in that massive oversized version. There was something interesting in every panel, and you could genuinely see that work, detail and attention has gone into every single line that was drawn. Everybody talks about Brian Hitch as sort of the architect for this blockbuster Hollywood style of art, but I think Ed McGuinness takes that to the very next level, and all you have to do is flick through this book and just look at some of the pages, the splash pages during the fight. It just engrosses you so much, it takes you along for that journey, and it makes it a very visceral one. My favourite part of Ed McGuinness's art was actually when it went into a cosmic side of it. So characters like the Witcher and Silver Surfer show up, and you also get some cool moments with Red Hulk interacting with them. Again, I'm not going to spoil that here, but a large part of the credit does also have to go to the colouring and the inking because that just makes the entire package come together. Because of how vibrant those colours were, particularly during the cosmic parts of this book, it made me wish that the majority of the story actually took place in outer space. As well, I like how he drew Doctor Strange's magics during the middle portion of this book, but I genuinely liked his Thor design most, and it kind of makes me me wish that Ed McGuinness would just do like a full Thor run. There were a few guest artists here and there like Art Adams and Frank Cho. Both of these helped provide some variety in the book, and it actually came within good sections of it because they were often given like their own little side story. So it didn't feel like it was taking too much away from the main book, because of course you always did just want more Ed McGuinness art, but it was good that it sectioned it away so that it didn't take away from the main plot or change the feel of it too much. However, I know he's a veteran of the comic industry, and I know you have to respect him for what he's done in the past, but John Romita Jr. takes over part of this book, and I just don't like his style. I'm sure he's a great dude in person, and with the output that he's got, it's clear that he's a very hard worker, and his dad is probably like the seminal Spider-Man artist. But why do all of his drawings look completely flat? They look like they're made out of paper. It reminded me of the PlayStation game Little Big Planet. Maybe this is part of the reason why I didn't like John Romita Jr.'s art, but it just feels like this guy literally drew everything. So I was looking through Dan Jurgens' Thor and John Romita Jr. was drawing that. I was looking through Kick-Ass and John Romita Jr. was drawing that. I was looking through Straczynski's Spider-Man and John Romita Jr. was drawing that. And then I looked through Avengers by Bendis and John Romita Jr. was drawing that. Maybe it's just me and I'm completely in the minority, but I just don't like this guy's style. He's in the same league as Corey Walker on Invincible, so when Invincible started up you had Corey Walker drawing it, and then Ryan Otley came on. Ryan Otley is the Ed McGuinness of this book. Every time he's not drawing this book you feel disappointed because you've got someone else who is nowhere near as good. Fortunately it's only temporary and only for a few issues, and Ed McGuinness does return for the end. So getting into the spoiler-free review part of this video, this book is dumb fun. That's the best and probably the only way that I can really describe this. It's a comic book equivalent of a summer blockbuster, of a popcorn flick, and if that's what you want, you will really enjoy this and it will entertain you. Because the fights in this are pretty insane, like we're not talking Invincible level, but it's just big dumb fun, you know, it's big characters beating other big characters. The first arc of this run was easily the best because it was just pure action. From the very first page, it's just fight after fight against other members of the Marvel Universe, and it doesn't really feel like anybody entirely gets left out. And for me, that's exactly what I sign up for when I buy a Hulk book. Like, I know the Peter David run is one of these like storied, historied runs that's like the seminal run that's the equivalent to the Walter Simonson run on Thor, because it explores the character Bruce Banner, but for me, I really like just seeing Hulk smash things. It's exactly the reason why we've got a character like the Hulk in the Marvel Universe to begin with. And as well, the first part of this book wasn't bogged down with some over-elaborate story, and it kind of made it clear exactly who it was that you wanted to think was the villain. I'd actually even say it went on until about the 14th issue, because there was a bit where there was like a tournament between other characters, and that's where I really felt like it was getting towards the end of each stride, because up until that point it felt like it knew exactly what you wanted and it just delivered on that. However, as the story got into the later issues, I do feel like it lost a lot of the steam that it brought from the first issue. The mystery over the identity of the Red Hulk does remain into the later issues, and it doesn't really feel like it ever overstayed its welcome, although it did feel like it came close, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the spoiler section. And speaking of which, I wouldn't say it dragged, but the last arc of this book was a bit exhausting. Again, not going to spoil anything here, but it felt like the equivalent of the end of the second Matrix film for me. So do you remember the first Matrix and all that great action, that great story, and you just loved all the characters in it? You were excited for that second one, and to me, the first half of this book reminded me a lot of that, because it just came with so much hype, there was so much momentum going forward with it, the characters were great, it was a spectacle to look at, and I was enjoying the story as it goes. So they've already given you all these great ideas, all these great scenes, a spectacle to look at, that there must clearly be something else coming up at the next turn. But there isn't. Instead, in its place is just an elaborate plan from an antagonist that you didn't really care about from the beginning, that all of a sudden is now the focal point of the entire story. And although they're more powerful and more of a threat to the main character, it just doesn't carry the same weight as the villains that you saw at the beginning of the book. Okay, yeah, maybe that metaphor didn't make as much sense as I thought, but my point is that this book already had a winning formula from the beginning, because it was great to see the Red Hulk just fighting everyone. This was effectively like a who's who in the Marvel Universe. And I feel like I end up saying this in the majority of books that I read, but if it didn't really have that long-term trajectory of a plot that it wanted to go through that made sense at every turn and actually built into something bigger, why didn't they just cut it short? If this would have been like 12 issues of just the Red Hulk fighting and then eventually you find out who he is, that probably would have been a really solid book. So the final act of this book doesn't really have that same emotional reaction that the first one did, because the enemy, at least for me personally, wasn't the one that I was hoping for, and as a result I just didn't care too much about those final fights as much as I did in the ones at the beginning. And unfortunately I can't say much more here without actually spoiling the book, so just wait till the spoiler section. We're nearly there now. One thing that I do have to mention, because if you look at the title and you look at the cover, you might think that this is a Bruce Banner story. This is 100% a Red Hulk book. It should be called the Red Hulk Omnibus. So if you were looking for a great Bruce Banner run, you won't find it here. Sure, the big old green giant does show up often enough throughout the book, but he's very rarely the focal point, and it also seems like they just tend to include him to either be a foil to the Red Hulk or to somehow incorporate him into the Red Hulk's plans. You never really see him effectively taking too much charge. There is one little instance towards the end that I'm not really going to spoil, but other than that, if you can't really get behind the character the Red Hulk, or you just don't like him as a concept, this book really isn't going to be for you. Again, yeah, you will still get some great moments with the character, and by the end of it, you will probably end up finding yourself saying Hulk is the strongest one there is, you know, during your sleep. But honestly, especially when you look at the cover, I found myself wanting a lot more of the original Hulk, seeing how the Red Hulk kind of takes over his life. You know, it could have been a story focused from Bruce Banner's perspective, and you see how this Red Hulk makes him question his own actions and things such as that. It felt like on a few occasions they were getting very close to doing that, but they never really fully committed to it. And I guess when I'm considering it from that perspective, I was kind of left disappointed. So we are getting into the spoil part of this book. I'm going to leave a timestamp down below so that you can skip to the final verdict, but it does kind of feel weird having a spoiler alert for a book where the main spoiler of the story is kind of fact now. But going into this book, I did already know that the Red Hulk was Thunderbolt Ross, and that didn't really take too much away from the story. Like, you may be like me and you're wondering if it's worth reading this book even if you know who the Red Hulk is, but it is still definitely worth your time, and you can still enjoy this despite knowing that spoiler. Like I said earlier, it didn't feel like the mystery of his identity was dragged out to me, but it might be different if you didn't know that already. Like, if you were reading this in single years, I imagine it might have been tough because it would have been nearly 2 years before you found out who the Red Hulk is. It is kind of cheating for me to say that it's kind of obvious now even though we already know the answer, but when you think about it and the way the story's structured, it kind of makes you wonder who else it could have been from the beginning. Because one thing that it did really put a dampener on was the Thunderbolt Ross death scene and the eventual funeral. If I was reading it in single issues though, at this point I probably would have been thinking that yeah, it definitely is him, considering that every character comes back alive. But with the knowledge that I had and knowing who the Red Hulk was, this did come across as a cheap tactic for me personally. However, the one big surprise for me, and what I hadn't heard about this book, maybe I've been living under a rock or something like that, was the whole thing about the Red She-Hulk. And it was a really welcome surprise in a book that I thought I knew all the twists for already. I did actually like that it turned out to be Betty, and I also liked her character design even though it was quite punk 90s kind of looking. Her inclusion into the story also spiced things up at a time when I felt like the story was tipping towards being a little bit stale. That was around the time when the Uncanny X-Force were coming into it, and I did like their inclusion because it kind of reminded me a little bit. Did you ever play the Ultimate Spider-Man game on like PS2 and Xbox? In that one mission where you're going around as Venom and then all of a sudden just Wolverine appears out of nowhere and you have to have a fight with him. That's exactly what that storyline felt like to me, and it's making me more excited to read Rick Remender's Uncanny X-Force. Although on a different topic, if I'm being completely honest, I didn't like Doc Samson in this. I've never really been a Doc Samson fan. He never seems to appear in too many books that I read, or at least if he does, he's not really that much of a primary focus. But for me, it just felt like he was solely in this book to throw a spanner in the works, and he was just there to kind of interrupt the plot or just to facilitate it so that there could be another obstacle to overcome. And when I look back and when I think about the story without flicking through it, it feels like he took up more of the focus of this story than Bruce Banner did in a story that's called Hulk with the Green Hulk and Bruce Banner on the front cover. Like, for me, maybe besides the exception of like Reed Richards and Ozymandias, I don't like characters who just always talk about how much superior intelligence they've got over everybody else. So yeah, admittedly, I feel like some people might disagree with me, but he was probably one of my least favourite parts of this book. However, do you remember that thing that I was referencing in the spoiler-free part of this book? Yeah, I was definitely talking about the hulked up versions of all the Marvel characters that came in the last arc. I really didn't like this, and I know I keep throwing this phrase around, but I just felt like it was a cheap tactic, and it kind of just diminished the end of this book when it started out so strong. It was weird because it actually made me reflect negatively on the concept of a Red Hulk that I was actually on board for earlier on in the story. I would have been fine with the standard Marvel characters teaming up together to take down the Red Hulk in a similar way that I thought was going to happen from the very beginning, because it seemed like the Red Hulk was going through all these characters one by one. Like, yeah, occasionally there was a little bit of a team up here and there, but for the most part they were always sort of separated so the Red Hulk could just completely walk through them. To me, I thought thematically that was going towards him being the eventual final boss for all of these characters, and there being some kind of like Avengers Endgame showdown between all of them. And part of its problem is because from the very beginning we've been following who was supposed to be the antagonist. Had they gone gone with the actual Marvel characters in their like fully conscious human forms for the most part, it would have given us a conflict of who we actually root for, because now the Red Hulk that originally we were kind of hoping would eventually be defeated by these characters is someone that we've grown to like and we actually kind of see him want to win. But do we really want to see him win against characters that we already love? That question would have been 100 times more interesting than the final fight that we actually got, because I would rather be burdened with a question that's difficult to answer rather than being disappointed by the solution that's being forced upon me. And you know, considering that there's been quite a bit of time since this story's ended, it makes me wonder if they ever originally intended to make the Red Hulk the hero of this story. As well, this book just sort of fizzles out and ends. The build up that we've been following for the 20 or so issues before that just felt like it was kind of for nothing. Of course, the Red Hulk appears in other comics, so it feels like maybe they were just setting up a story that would eventually be answered in a later series, but if I was reading this in single issues, I would have been really disappointed by the time that last issue hit. But in hindsight, I don't even really know what type of ending I was rooting for, so maybe I was just disappointed by the fact that it came to an end from that final arc rather than the actual ending itself. So for my final verdict, this book is dumb. Like I said it earlier and I'll say it again because it is the best way to describe Jeph Loeb's run on the Hulk. But for the most part, I do actually mean that as a compliment, because just because something dumb doesn't mean it can't be entertaining. I recently saw a similar debate with Dragon Ball Z because people were saying that Dragon Ball Z isn't good manga because of the fact that it's just sort of like dumb action. But not everything needs to be nuanced, not everything needs to be layered and have so much subtle context and subtlety to it that you can't even understand it for years after the books come out. Sometimes you just want to see a Hulk punch every character in the Marvel universe in the face, and that's exactly what you get here. The first 12 or so issues in this book was welcomed fun, and it was some of just the most enjoyable reading that I've had in a long time. It was nice to relax my brain and get exactly what I wanted out of a Hulk book, even if it wasn't the Bruce Banner that I wanted. Some of that same energy does carry on into the later arcs, it just doesn't have that pure enjoyability to it that was seen earlier. It's worth a read even if you do know who the Red Hulk is, but don't go into this expecting like this character seminal run on the Hulk, because you're not going to get it here. Or for that fact, don't even go into this expecting a narrative that's got that pre-planned trajectory that you often like to see. If you go into this for some summer blockbuster popcorn movie fun, then you're definitely going to have a great time with this and you'll probably want the omnibus. This gets 3 woofs out of 5. Woof, woof, woof. So that's been the review. This one took me quite a lot of time to actually get the script finished for it, and I do hope that you enjoyed it. If you've read this book, leave your review in the comment section below. Do you think I'm completely wrong, or do you agree with me on any of my points? If you like this video, please remember to give it a thumbs up, and if you didn't like this video, why did you get this far? Please subscribe if you haven't already. Remember to click that bell notification. I don't know what I'm going to do when I get to 1,000 subscribers, but if you've got any ideas for what I can do to celebrate, just leave that in the comment section below as well. If you want to show your support for this channel and you're planning on buying yourself a book, I've got Amazon affiliate links below. It doesn't increase the price, I don't see any of your details, it does just help the channel because I'm trying to buy a better camera, so that you can see this ugly face in 4K HD resolution. But please check out some of my links up there so that you don't miss a video, and please just share this with your friends or any communities that you're in. But more than anything, just make sure that you stay safe, keep reading, and keep barking all you mad dogs, and I'll see you at the next video.